One quick thing before I get going in earnest. My remarks today stem from a body of work that I've co-authored over the years with my friend Craig Martin, who's the co-author of that book. Craig's a philosopher at Harding University, and we've done several projects together, and I wanted to acknowledge that. I wanted to point that out as just a way of acknowledging that this lecture really does stem from the work of two minds, not just one. So any credit that I might deserve, I really need to share with Craig. For example, he's clearly responsible for anything that I say that might be unclear or confusing or wrong. I'm just going to throw Craig right under the bus. Just kidding. Okay. There are certain things in life that we are morally obligated to do, whether we want to or not. We have a duty to take care of our kids, for example. We have an obligation to make good on our promises and pay our debts. Likewise, there are things which we are morally forbidden to do. We have a duty not to put others needlessly in harm's way, for instance. And we have an obligation to refrain from things like murder, theft, fraud, and adultery. When we do things that are morally prohibited, or when we fail to do what's morally required, we are blameworthy. And in some cases, we can be rightly coerced or punished. But what makes it true that we have these sorts of obligations in the first place? Where do they come from, and how do they arise? What's the most basic explanation or cause or ground of these moral duties? What is their source? These are different ways of getting at the same question. What are the metaphysical foundations of morality? Now, how one answers that question is, of course, going to depend upon other things that one believes about the underlying nature of reality. I'm assuming that most of us here, perhaps all of us here, believe in God. And those of us who are theists, and Christians in particular, it can seem pretty natural to expect that morality would, at least in some way, relate to the sustainer and creator of the universe. But what exactly is God's relationship to morality supposed to be, anyway? And how should Christians think about that? There's an ancient problem knocking around in the background here, one that traces back to Plato, a problem known as Euthyphro's dilemma. The dilemma, in short, is this, and you can follow along on your handout. I can't do anything without a handout. So when all else fails, look at the handout. Euthyphro's dilemma. The dilemma, in short, is this. Does God command us to do certain things because he knows that those things are morally obligatory? Or are those things morally obligatory in the first place precisely because God commands them? Now, as it turns out, how one responds to that question has a pretty significant effect on one's framework for thinking about ethics, and Christian ethics in particular. And since at least the time of Plato, and especially in the Christian tradition, religious explanations of the foundations of morality have typically fallen into one of two competing camps, and you can see there on your handout. To one side is natural law theory, and to the other side is theological voluntarism, or what's better known these days as divine command theory, as I'll call it. So let me just give you a quick primer on those two ethical theories just to rev the engines a bit. Take natural law theory first. According to the natural law theory tradition, objective moral values and duties arise in connection to necessary truths, or facts about the sorts of creatures we are by nature, facts that we can discover and reason about for ourselves, facts that God is responsible for. More specifically on this view, what makes an action right or wrong at the most basic level depends on whether the action most appropriately pursues what's good for us as humans. Accordingly, morality is ultimately directed toward human flourishing. Moral laws are natural in the sense that they're binding on us in virtue of our nature as humans, and they're natural in the sense that they're knowable to us by nature through the right use of reason. Though, of course, God's revealed commands might aid us in discerning the requirements of the natural law with improved clarity. So we might say for natural law theory, there's something like a divinely imprinted grain to the universe. And so the better part of wisdom is to discern the direction of that grain and work with it and not against it. Within the Christian tradition, at least, this view is most often, though not exclusively, associated with Roman Catholicism, thanks in no small part to the influence of Thomas Aquinas. To the other side of the divide is divine command theory, which is often associated with typically Protestant traditions that emphasize the supremacy of God's will and the importance of special revelation. This view can be traced back through Calvin and Luther to such thinkers as William of Ockham, and especially, in my view, Andrew of Neufchâteau in the 14th century. On this view, moral obligations arise directly in virtue of God's commands or some other prescriptive act of the divine will. More to the point, what makes an action right or wrong is simply that God commands it or forbids it. Importantly, on this view, God's commands don't merely communicate what our obligations are. Instead, God's commands are the right-making or wrong-making mechanism itself. So ultimately, we're going to be dependent on God's revelation of his commands, and so goes divine command theory. Now, as it turns out, within the Stone Campbell Restoration tradition, and that's the very tradition that gives rise to the Churches of Christ and hence to Pepperdine, within this tradition, our tradition, there appears to be something of a third way of explaining the foundations of morality, one that I'm pleased to say is neither Catholic nor Protestant. Some of you will get that old reference, I think. At the very least, there are the makings of a third way within the Stone Campbell tradition, which is something like a combination of natural law theory and divine command theory, which I just mentioned. Surprisingly, such a position has been relatively underexplored in the history of moral philosophy, and at least from everything I can gather about that. And it's certainly been neglected in recent decades by philosophers, so that's what I figured I'd talk a bit about today. So this is kind of a prolegomena to the book that you have, connecting it to our heritage. My agenda is twofold. First, I'd like to reconstruct that third way a little bit that's plausibly attributable to the Stone Campbell tradition. And then I want to sketch a preliminary case for why I think this position is actually superior to the natural law and divine command theory camps in answering that ancient problem known as Euthyphro's dilemma. Accordingly, my remarks are one part history and one part philosophical argument. So without further ado, let's turn to the Stone Campbell tradition, shall we? In 1820, Alexander Campbell argued that there are two fundamental categories of moral duties, what he called moral positive duties on the one hand and moral natural duties on the other. And I'm going to quote a bit from Campbell and others, and I'm just not going to do the quote, end quote thing. It's just a little cumbersome. You can see the actual quotations on your handout and the references to it in the back, but I'm quoting a bunch, shall we? For Campbell, moral positive duties are those obligations that arise strictly in virtue of the fact that God commands us to do something. These duties are, quote, altogether in the divine command, such that they depend entirely for their moral obligation upon some express precept of the deity. The fact that these moral positive duties exist, together with what those duties actually are, is made known to us exclusively through the supernatural revelation of God's will. Campbell claims, for example, that nature in her most improved state could not discover the propriety of moral positive duties. In other words, were we left to our own devices, we wouldn't be capable of discovering that we have these moral positive duties, what they are, or why they're imposed on us by God in the first place. In fact, Campbell goes as far to say that with respect to moral positive duties, we're not authorized to reason about what we should do because God's reasons for imposing those duties on us are inscrutable. And were we to attempt to reason about those matters, we'd be easily led astray. So our job is simply to respect God's authority and obey his commands. And as a paradigmatic example of such a moral positive duty, Campbell points to the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, quoting here. Adam in Eden could not, by the exercise of any faculty he possessed, see anything in the nature of the forbidden fruit, prohibiting him from the use of it, rendering it sinful for him to touch it. The positive precept of the Almighty alone rendered it a sin for him to eat it and a duty for him to abstain from it. Now, to the other side, in addition to moral positive duties, Campbell held that there are also moral natural duties, whose obligation is not only in the divine command, but also in the nature of things. Whereas moral positive duties are right because they're commanded by God, moral natural duties are commanded by God because they are right. I mean, he's talking directly to the Euthyphro dilemma. And Campbell claims also that moral natural duties are more or less discernible by mankind merely by the light of reason, by the light of nature, sorry. So, for example, Campbell argued that even without a divine command, Adam knew full well that it was right to love his wife, and that even long after the fall, we humans today are able to perceive such virtues as truth, honesty, and common justice to be held in the nature of things necessary and right, and that they are in themselves right. The basic idea is that at least some things are intrinsically right or wrong for us. And furthermore, we have some sort of natural capacity for knowing about these obligations, however limited that capacity may be. Now, unfortunately, Campbell doesn't offer much of a detailed analysis of moral natural duties. But no matter what it may have been on his view, and despite what best explains their existence, they're not dependent upon the divine command. They are, in principle, discoverable through the proper use of human reason. Now, Campbell's distinction between moral positive duties and moral natural duties clearly remained influential throughout the religious tradition that followed him. A full century later, within the Stone Campbell tradition, it was on display, this time in the work of C.R. Nichol and R.L. Whiteside. For example, in their influential 1920 book, Sound Doctrine, Nichol and Whiteside distinguished between what they called moral laws and positive laws, quoting here. Moral laws are laws which have to do with man's relationship to his fellows and his moral life. In this class, thou shalt not kill, steal, lie, etc. Had Jehovah never given a law covering these and kindred matters, it would have been wrong to steal, kill, etc. Such laws are right within themselves. Positive laws are laws which God has enacted and which depend wholly upon Jehovah's authority to make them right. They were right to be observed because God commanded them. Had he not commanded them, there would be no grounds for their observance. So clearly enough, the Campbellite distinction, if not the exact same terminology, retained pride of place within the Stone Campbell tradition for at least 100 years. In fact, this distinction between moral natural duties and moral positive duties was really quite pervasive during the century between Campbell and Nichol and Whiteside. For example, appeals to it can be found in the work of several key restorationists, including David Lipscomb, James Harding, J.W. McGarvey, W.H. Hobson, Isaac Errett, J.S. Sweeney, Benjamin Franklin, the descendant, not the founder. Maybe some of them called you from the grave. It's interesting to me that Campbell, as well as Nichol and Whiteside, tried to explain why there would need to be two basic categories of moral duties in the first place. That is, why there would need to be moral positive duties in addition to moral natural duties. Why is that? For Campbell, the existence of moral positive duties allows for a kind of test of loyalty, of human willingness to submit to God's authority. Extending that line of reasoning just a bit, Nichol and Whiteside put that point like this, and I'm quoting here from Nichol and Whiteside. This is on your handout. The essence of obedience is willing submission to authority. A man may do some things which God commands everyone to do without in the least obeying God. He may do it because of the pressure of the circumstances or because his reason suggests it's the proper thing to do. Hence, in all ages, God has had some test of obedience, some way to test man's loyalty to him. We can see a reason for many things God commands, and while we must in all such cases comply, there is no test of our loyalty in such cases. In a test of faith or loyalty, there must be no apparent connection between the act commanded and the result promised, and there should be no outside circumstances or surroundings impelling us. The command must be such that the moving cause is our reverence for God and our devotion to him. Think of it this way. If there are obligations that arise solely from divine commands, obligations that are totally different from natural duties, then there could also be a disconnect between doing the right thing strictly out of obedience to God and doing the right thing precisely because of its connection to some humanly discernible good. Accordingly, moral positive duties help drive sunlight between the performance of the morally right act on the one hand and any reasons a person might have for performing it on the other. This disconnect, in turn, allows a person's motives for doing the right thing to be isolated and brought to the surface for evaluation. And all of that provides a basis for testing a man's fidelity that would not otherwise be in the cards. In some respects, the Campbellite view about the importance of moral positive duties runs parallel to Kant's view that an act, even a dutiful act, lacks moral worth unless the agent does her duty strictly for the sake of doing her duty. That was Kant's famous trope there. For Kant, if you do your duty for some reason other than the fact that it was your moral duty, say because the act was connected to some good end, then you really aren't following the moral law strictly out of respect for the moral law. So in that case, you're not exclusively obeying the moral law, you're obeying something else too. To take Kant's own well-known example, suppose a store owner refuses to price gouge her customers in a time of crisis. Not because she's overly worried about doing the right thing, but because she anticipates that price gouging would eventually damage her reputation and hurt her business in the long run. In that case, the store owner has done her duty all right, but not for the sake of doing her duty. And to that extent, she's not morally praiseworthy, even though she's done the right thing. However, if the store owner charges a fair price for the sake of doing the morally right thing, no matter how it might affect her long-term interest, then she's exemplified on Kant's view of goodwill and is morally praiseworthy to that extent. So following Kant, Campbell or Nicol and Whiteside might say that if someone does what God commands because the act promotes some humanly discernible good, then she fails to act strictly for the sake of obeying God. Instead, she's acting, at least partly, for the sake of something else, namely her own reasoning about that discernible good end. And to that extent, she fails to be faithful to God in the strictest sense, and hence to be morally praiseworthy, or so they might say. Now, to be perfectly blunt, I don't really know whether Nicol and Whiteside or Campbell actually did or would accept the Kantian position. And my primary concern here really isn't with whether they did or would. After all, it seems to me they very well could deny the Kantian position and still affirm that there's something of real significance that's attainable only when there's no apparent connection between a divine command and some humanly discernible good end. Alternatively, they could affirm the Kantian position and still assert that human flourishing is ultimately attained only by means of obeying God's commands. Nonetheless, the fact that it can seem tricky to say whether Campbell and company affirmed or rejected the Kantian position on moral motivation highlights an important fact about these thinkers. It's hard to say whether they endorsed the Kantian view, because it's hard to say whether they presume that the primary source of morality is most fundamentally about flourishing or about obedience to God. And that's precisely because they seem to think that moral obligations can arise either from God's commands or from the fact that something leads to human flourishing. So there's my history lesson for now, which if you forget everything else that I said up to this point, hang on to three things. One, several key figures in the Stone Campbell tradition held that moral obligations can be divided into two subsets: moral positive duties on the one hand, moral natural duties on the other. Two, the moral life requires us to do both. And three, that there's an important good, a constructive test of faith perhaps, or the chance to obey strictly out of obedience to God, that really isn't feasible unless we can't see why why we should perform the divinely commanded act. That last point's not really essential for the view that I'm going to attribute to the Stone Campbell tradition, but it seems to have been attractive to several of its key figures. At any rate, the Stone Campbell tradition provides some inspiration and some resources for imagining a genuinely distinctive third way for thinking about the foundations of morality, one that's not fully reducible to natural law theory or to divine command theory. For simplicity's sake moving forward, let's just call that the combination theory, since it's effectively a combination of those two components. Okay. Now for part two of my talk. There's a nod to the Thomist in the room. So what? Who cares? Why does any of this matter? I should answer that, shouldn't I? Well, it matters because the combination theory really is a better explanation of how moral obligations arise by comparison to the standard natural law and divine command theory accounts. And I know that's a hefty claim, what I just said, and I'm not going to have enough time to defend it fully. Hopefully the book will do some heavy lifting for you if you're curious about the full argument. But what I'd like to do is just sketch how that argument might run. And it goes something like this. Natural law theory and divine command theory each have something going for it, but each is incomplete and stands in need of supplementation. That's roughly the argument. Now, let's start by accentuating the positive, shall we? Both natural law theory and divine command theory are indeed able to offer a coherent explanation for why we have certain obligations. Take natural law theory first. Some of our moral obligations do appear to be determined by necessary truths and or facts about the created order, including human nature, and or facts about human goods and practical reason. For example, and this is an awful example, okay? Forgive the gruesomeness of this example and the timing of it all. Why do we have a moral obligation to refrain from killing people for fun? I know that's awful, but think about it for a second. What makes it a moral obligation to abstain from killing people for fun? Well, such an obligation would appear to arise downstream from a world like the very one we occupy. Given the set of facts about creatures like us, including, for example, that life and health are part of what make us what we are, in combination with facts about the created order that we're in, certain obligations seem to follow naturally enough. One way to see this same point from another angle is just to imagine a world in which we would not have an obligation to refrain from killing people for fun. Maybe there's some logically possible world in which those who are killed for fun immediately spring back to life with enhanced autonomy and a greater capacity for wisdom and health, increased serotonin levels, thicker and more luscious hair, darker hair. Right? If there were such a possible world, and I'm not sure there is one, but if there were such a possible world, it would surely be very, very different from the world we're in, right? In the actual world, killing people for fun violates basic human goods. It causes immense suffering and cruelty and destruction of autonomy and death, and it damages the human community in profound ways. Yet if there were a possible world wherein such an act were actually profitable without negative side effects, then in that world, perhaps, agents wouldn't have an obligation to refrain from killing for fun. But notice, given that the actual created order is the way it is, and given facts about human nature in combination with facts about human goods, certain moral obligations appear to follow with a certain kind of necessity. So goes natural law theory right there. Fair enough. So natural law theory can explain how some or even most of our moral obligations seem to arise. The problem comes in when we ask whether a natural law theory account can be given for each and every one of our moral obligations. And unfortunately, in my view, the answer here seems to be no. That's because it seems plausible to me that at least some of our moral obligations are not and cannot be explained by natural law theory. That is, it seems plausible that we have at least one or some moral obligations that are not and cannot be explained by appealing to basic human goods or human flourishing or violations of practical reason or some combination of all that. Now, why does that seem plausible to me? First off, notice how natural law theory's trademark effort to explain how obligations arise implicitly assumes that for each of the possible explanations one might propose, if we only knew all of the relevant facts, we could, in theory, provide a complete list of the reasons why the act in question was morally obligatory. Accordingly, given natural law theory, the answer to the question of why is X, whatever X is, why is X morally obligatory, would never terminate in something like, because God said so, but rather in the reasons God surely must have had in mind for saying so in the first place. All right? But suppose there were a situation in which God were to command someone to do something, but not because there were a list of reasons that fully determined how God must command in that situation. Suppose, in other words, that it were possible that God's commands were on some occasions simply underdetermined by all the relevant reasons at God's disposal. Call such a command a rationally underdetermined divine command. It's a mouthful. Now, if rationally underdetermined divine commands are even possible, then it's possible for there to be a moral obligation that is not and cannot be explained by natural law theory. Now, why is that exactly? This is a little technical, forgive me. Theists can all surely agree that God's sincerely commanding us to X entails that, in fact, there is a decisive reason for us to X, even if we don't or can't know what that decisive reason actually is. After all, no serious theist would want to claim that God might sincerely command us to X, and yet we don't have a decisive reason to X. Why? Well, insofar as God is omniscient, God would surely know any and all reasons for someone to X, and because God is perfectly good, God would sincerely command someone to X only if there were, in fact, a decisive reason to X. But if it were possible for divine commands to be rationally underdetermined in the way that I'm considering here, then God could sincerely issue those sorts of commands, surely. So suppose God were to issue a rationally underdetermined command. Insofar as God sincerely commanding us to X entails that there is, in fact, a decisive reason to X, then God's commanding us to X, in this case, would itself be the decisive reason for us to X. So the answer to the question of what makes X obligatory in this case would effectively be because God said so. What that means then is that if rationally underdetermined divine commands are possible, then it's possible for there to be moral obligations that can't be explained by natural law theory, in which case natural law theory is simply incomplete as an explanation of the foundation of morality, and hence as the framework for Christian ethics. Now, why should we think that rationally underdetermined divine commands are possible in the first place? This is a two-part move here, in part because we can imagine unproblematic cases of underdetermined human commands. Consider the following case. This is the pardon case, I'll call it. You can follow on your handout there. Gavin has the authority to pardon one and only one of two persons on death row. There are no morally relevant differences between the two inmates, and so there's no reason for pardoning the one versus the other inmate. Gavin simply chooses one. His choice isn't completely determined by a prior reason about who deserved it most. He just willed that one should live. This case seems just. And what makes the pardon guy's fate just is not Gavin's reason for willing this man versus willing that man. Reasons do not because they cannot determine the matter here. Rather, the thing that makes the man's fate just is simply Gavin's choice in the matter. So it seems that we can imagine cases of rationally underdetermined human commands. Could there be a divine command like that? Well, why not? Surely it's conceivable that at least one of God's commands is sufficiently similar to the decision that Gavin makes in the pardon case, such that the prior reasons do not fully determine how God must command, but simply the divine will, what God chooses. Here's an example, affirmed by the Jewish and Christian traditions. God commanded the Israelites to rest on the seventh day. Accordingly, when God commanded the Israelites to rest on the seventh day, resting on the seventh day became morally obligatory for them. If God were to stop commanding them to rest on the seventh day, then it would no longer be obligatory for them to rest on the seventh day. And God's reasons for commanding the Israelites to rest on the seventh day, as opposed to the third day of the week or fourth or whatever, don't appear to be fully determinative. In other words, it seems plausible enough that God's command to rest on the seventh day, as opposed to the third or the fourth day of the week, wasn't fully determined by prior facts about human nature or human flourishing, or even facts about the created order, or facts about the divine nature, and so on. God's command here, like with any choice one might face between equally good options, was plausibly rationally underdetermined, though it wasn't thereby unjust or problematically arbitrary. So if we were to ask, why was resting on the seventh day morally obligatory for the Israelites? The answer to the question seems to me to be something like, because God said so. But if that's right, then there's at least one moral obligation that the Christian faith presumes that natural law theory can't explain. And if so, then natural law theory is incomplete. And the real takeaway point here isn't that natural law theory is wrong. It's just that it needs to be supplemented, which means that we're going to need to look beyond natural law theory when asking about how moral obligations arise, and hence when doing Christian ethics. That's pretty important. Now, the temptation at this juncture might be to swing to the other horn of Euthyphro's dilemma and just assume that divine command theory really is where we should be, right? So what about divine command theory? Notice how it stands ready at hand to explain our moral obligations. We're obligated to do this or that. Why? Because God commands it. Accordingly, we might think that Christian ethics is simply a matter of discerning and properly interpreting divine commands. And in one way, this is so Protestant it hurts, right? Just read the text for God's explicit commands, examples, and draw out the right inferences. Fair enough. But can divine command theory explain all of our moral obligations? Well, not so fast. Remember that divine command theory holds that our most foundational moral imperative is to obey God's commands. But here's a tricky question. What makes it morally obligatory to obey God's commands in the first place? Now, given divine command theory, the temptation might be to think that the answer would be, well, God commands us to obey God's commands. But that's not going to cut it, because if the answer to the question at hand is effectively God commands us to obey God's commands, notice how a new question would emerge just on the horizon. What makes obeying that prior or meta-level command morally obligatory? And off to the races we go, ladies and gentlemen. We have a bona fide regress problem. So to give a complete explanation for how our moral obligations arise, proponents of divine command theory need to answer the million-dollar question at hand in a way that cuts this potential regress off at the pass. So how might we do this? Consider three fairly prominent responses to the question, why do we have an obligation to obey God's commands? One is simply that we owe God, as the creator of all things that we have ever enjoyed or will ever enjoy, a debt of gratitude, which in turn rightly drives us to accept the authority of the one to whom we are so indebted. A second answer to the question, why should we obey God's commands, is that we belong to our Creator. That was John Locke's view, by the way. We're God's property, as it were. And insofar as we're God's property, he has a legitimate right to command as he sees fit, and we have an obligation to obey him. A third answer to the question hails from John Duns Scotus from the medieval period. According to Scotus, it is necessarily true and self-evident from the terms involved that God is to be loved. The term God refers to a supremely perfect being, and hence to what's maximally good. The term good refers to what's to be loved. So it's necessarily true that God is to be loved. And if God is perfectly good, God is to be loved above all things, right? Think of the Shema there or something like that. At a minimum, to love God is to will what God wills for us to will, which is just another way of saying that to love God is to obey God. So it follows then on Scotus's view that the claim God is to be obeyed is necessarily true and self-evident, at least when we properly understand the terms involved. All right, deep breath, take stock of the situation here. Suppose we just grant that all three of those answers are plausible enough responses to the question of what makes it obligatory to obey God's commands. And I actually find them all relatively compelling. Notice that in any case, and this point's key, none of those accounts reduces to the claim that God commanded us to obey God's commands. That is, none of those accounts tries to answer the question at hand by appealing to some prior or meta-level divine command. And for good reason. Appealing to a prior or meta-level divine command just begs the question and invites the very regress problem that proponents of divine command theory really need to avoid. What this means then is that there's at least one moral obligation that is not and cannot be grounded in some fact about God's commanding, namely the foundational moral obligation to obey God's commands. And that point's key. Responding honestly to the regress problem on behalf of divine command theory exposes the fact that divine command theory is by itself incomplete. We have at least one moral obligation that can't be caused or constituted or otherwise ontologically grounded in a divine command. So let's land the plane, shall we? If what I've said here is correct, then not only is natural law theory incomplete, but so is divine command theory. So what should we do? Are we doomed? No. It seems to me that the answer is hiding in plain sight. It seems to me that the answer is one that attempts with the better angels of the Stone Campbell tradition to recover and restore a view that could have been more easily held in a time before Christians had divided ourselves so starkly on the matter in the 13th and 14th centuries. It seems to me that the answer is one that is neither Catholic nor Protestant precisely because it is both Catholic and Protestant. It seems to me that the answer is something akin to the combination theory espoused by several representative thinkers associated with the Stone Campbell tradition. And that's a pretty neat win for the home team, or so I say. But more importantly, and to put the point a different way, the combination theory is, to twist a line from Lewis, merely Christian. And that's important to me because it locates a framework for ethics and hence character development on a model that aims for the unity of believers, which Christ prayed for explicitly in John 17. So, to wrap things up, An ancient problem for Christian ethics is basically a version of the question that Socrates posed to poor Euthyphro all those years ago. Does God command us to do what's morally obligatory because it's already obligatory? Or are God's commands what makes something morally obligatory to begin with? I've argued for the combination of natural law theory and divine command theory. Some of our moral obligations stem from necessary truths or facts about the created order, including human nature, full stop. Some of our obligations stem from divine commands, period. And those two explanations aren't in any real competition with one another on final analysis. It's a combination. I leave you with a formal summary of my argument on the handout at the appendix, just to make as explicit as I know how the premises that I affirm. You can decide whether or not I'm right. At any rate, it's an honor and a treat to be back here at Pepperdine. Thank you.